Welcome to this panel discussion in collaboration with GDI, the Global Development Institute, to reimagine a better aid system. You may or may not know that the DSA is the UK-based membership organization for all those studying, researching, and teaching in the field of global development. So if you're new to us, please have a look at the chat because there'll be more information on the DSA, how you can become a member, and perhaps attend our conference, which will be in June this year. Our moderator today is Peter Sartorius, a lecturer at the University of Leeds, and he's the co-author of a new book, which will also be mentioned in the chat in a minute. So he is ideal to help us reimagine aid. I'll hand over to Peter now. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for joining and for the wonderful panel that I will introduce shortly. I'm just going to begin with a few remarks, just for a few minutes to give some context to the conversation that we are about to have. I think many of us are here today because of some of the recent events that have meant that the world of aid feels very different from the way it felt a few months ago. But what I would like to point out is that this crisis of development is not something that has only happened this year or a couple of months ago. It is a longer set of processes that have been impacting on development, ranging from the rising authoritarianism in different parts of the world, but also previous cuts to aid here in the UK and in other countries, and of course also new challenges that the development landscape has been facing as a result of climate change, as a result of COVID and other crises. The list is really quite long, and I think what tends to happen when we get into a sort of crisis thinking mode is that we look for quick solutions, quick answers. And as a result, our imagination is not necessarily something that we deploy in navigating the crisis. In other words, crises tend to result in the narrowing of the imaginative space of what we think is possible or even desirable, of the kinds of worlds that we are trying to build or rebuild through development. And I suppose I would just like to caution us against that trap of that short-termist thinking. And I'd like to encourage taking a longer view on some of the issues that we are about to talk about. Of course, there is also the old saying about crises being opportunities, and often a crisis is seen as a point in time where things can change dramatically, potentially also for the better. But again, I think historically, if we look at how that tends to unfold, often what comes out of crises is a new buzzword or a new approach or some kind of a radically new idea. And actually, the argument that Uma and I make in this new book, Reimagining Development, is that there are actually a lot of accumulated ideas out there. Development as an idea has been around for a long period of time. Lots of people have been thinking and talking about development for many decades. And there is this accumulated knowledge and wisdom that helps us reimagine what development might mean. And so, again, I would like to just caution us to not necessarily try and pursue this sort of ubiquitous quest for novelty and always keep looking for the new thing and the next thing. And to also have that view of history, of the sort of intellectual history of the idea of development, and to draw on that as we navigate the current moment. This is also something which is linked to this proposed new idea of the development humanities, which is a paper by the anthropologist and development scholar David Lewis that was recently published, and of which this book that Uma and I wrote is also a part of that conversation about what the development humanities could mean. And I think what that idea of development humanities encourages us to do is to think about what kinds of knowledge actually counts in conversations about development. Is it just numbers? Is it just statistics? Or is it some of the deeper insights as well from the humanities, from the arts? David Lewis writes that the goal of development humanities is to leverage radical interdisciplinarity in drawing from distinctive modes of analysis and meaning-making practices common in humanities disciplines such as textual interpretation, narrative analysis, and critical deliberation in illuminating development encounters. And again, this might sound really complex. It might sound messy. It might sound like a luxury that we haven't got the ability to afford right now. But I would just encourage us to not lose sight of that. So with these ideas in mind, I would like to turn to our panel today. I'm first just going to quickly introduce the four members of the panel. Nicola Banks from the Global Development Institute, Divine Fu from University of Cape Town, Sue Roberts from University of Kentucky, and Bright Simmons from ODI. And for the first part of today's conversation, I'm just going to pose a question to the panel, and I'm going to ask everybody to answer in 2 to 3 minutes so that we get a variety of perspectives. And the question is, what is the silver lining here? What do you see as the potential positive aspect of the moment that we find ourselves in? Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Peter, and hi, everyone. I think it's really hard to present anything as a silver lining in the context that we find ourselves in, but I do think there is space for opportunities for us to rethink and reimagine and build back better, which is what I wanted to talk about today. So for me and many, what this recent series of events has really driven home is the fact that the entire system that we have now cannot provide the foundations for a just, sustainable future for people and planet. It has proven itself entirely incapable of doing that and entirely capable of being destroyed very quickly. So it has to change. I think why it's been so devastating, well, the financial side and the implications of that is so devastating, but also devastating is that it's taken place at a time in which the sector felt like it was moving in the right direction. More organizations talking about localization, more organizations moving towards locally led development. But our research in that area showed that despite lots of incredible people and organizations' best intentions, the changes that were taking place were quite business as usual, so staying within the existing systems and improving them slightly, rather than leading to any radical reimagined systems that work for Southern organizations, that work for communities around the world. So despite this being what Southern communities and organizations, the Shift the Power movement have been demanding, a space for a Southern-led rebuilt system, a space for community-led philanthropy, that space wasn't open because we were still asking what was happening from the top-down perspective. And I think there is more space for that now. I think the other thing that this really highlights to me is that we in the development industry, whether that's donors, INGOs, us as academics, we haven't been taking the public with us with these conversations. We've been talking about progress, we've been critiquing the systems, but we haven't been doing that in a way that boosts trusts and takes the public with us rather than actually further erodes trust and buy-in. I was really shocked there was virtually no backlash in the UK when we had our round of recent cuts announced. Around the world, there's as many people applauding what's happening as there are condemning it, and that is very damning. So for me, making sure that all of us as actors, and I think as academics, we can play a kind of a neutral role there, is bringing the public with us, letting us know why we do need systems. The systems are not working as they are right now, but we can make them better. And there's a role for all of them, all of us in that. I think that's where my recent work has taken me. We're building a new social movement that foregrounds citizens as agents of change called One World Together. And the idea there is it's us as agents of change that can believe in a better system, that can build a better system, and we can unite around values such as solidarity rather than languages such as tax and efficiency and value for money.
Thank you so much for that positive message. Over to you, Divine.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to read it in two ways. I think that on the one side, it's important, I think, to acknowledge the dystopia and also the particular challenge that this particular dystopia, which is confronting us, presents to us, and the ways in which it, in a way, disenables us to think differently or to even imagine anything differently, and the ways in which we are also shocked about it, and the fact that in a way we have not prepared for it. So that tells a lot about us, and that also tells a lot about the ways in which we have taken the context and the system under which we have lived more seriously than we should. So that's important. So we have it's an opportunity to ask a lot of questions about us and about the things that we take seriously. We, I think, have been located in a system which has trained us to outsource these questions, and that our response is first to ask the question outside without having to look internally. What we have done or what has happened to us, because there is something that we must have done, and something that we should be doing that should help us to build or to rebuild internally. And I think for me that's where the opportunity is. And here, when you raise the issue of crisis, I think we're talking in this context about development assistance, about the end of aid, of the transfer of resources, of the transfer of goods, of the transfer of services, the things that come to us as technical support, the things that come to us as military support, as health, as many other things. So it's very important to also think concretely what we are talking about. And these are things that on one side for many years have been celebrated and also have really gone to support many vulnerable positions, but that have also come with a lot of trouble, and that have undermined also the sovereignty and the opportunities of many countries to have to advance. So as we move forward, I think it's an opportunity to take that serious. How do we move with it to another place where we really continue with redistributing these resources, dealing with the inequalities that actually push one place to continue supporting another? You know, I just saw the rankings of happiness the other day. And I saw 2 countries, or 2 or 3 of the top 10 countries ranked happy. And I was wondering, what is happiness when other people are unhappy? I thought happiness was something that you shared. So when we get to a point where we begin to rank people happy when they are operating in a world where there's so much trouble, I think those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. So there is an opportunity to rethink our relationship, to rethink our values, to rethink what we have considered to be dignity, to rethink the world in which we have lived, where we think a group of other people are those that we have to keep supporting while we accumulate and live in comfort. So this aid system is something that we should be asking ourselves about, and I think that's the greatest opportunity.
Thank you so much. That is very much in the spirit of what we're trying to do today. Over to you, Sue.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from the United States, and that's where my work has been focused, looking at the way in which development, or the development industrial aid complex, is kind of organized here. So that's kind of the context for my thoughts on this. But I agree very much with Nicola and with Divine's comments that we've got multiple things going on at once here, and there may be opportunities for some really big rethinking to go on. First of all, I think that we've seen here with the destruction, basically, of USAID, we've seen a smashing of a system that wasn't great, okay? That we were certainly, many of us, critics of and had pointed out some deep flaws in. It's slightly unnerving to see those same critiques being leveraged to absolutely smash up the thing to pieces, right? When we might have wanted a more gradual, thoughtful, logical kind of approach. But the other part to this that don't know how well it's understood elsewhere is that the destruction of USAID was also deeply motivated by a kind of culture war element that's going on in the United States. And so it was part of this critique of wokeness, of propping, to the critics, propping up fluffy programs aimed at gender, this, that, and the other, a whole, what one critic has called a word salad of words that they don't like, right? So this was also a very motivating factor. And to Nicola's point, I don't think many of us understood how aid could be linked to these kind of culture wars in this way. And that was a motivation in part behind the destruction of USAID. But I think what that does open then is exactly what Divine was pointing to, which is a question about, well, what are our values then? Okay, if we don't value these things, what do we value? Do we, and I'm speaking here primarily of the United States population, do we value being a country that can be counted on for humanitarian assistance to provide food aid in conditions of famine or of extreme displacement? What do we value? You know, what is the role of the United States? And I might say a bit more of that later on in this panel, but I think this is a big opportunity for a major rethink. And I don't know if it will reckon exactly with the underlying questions of justice and of, you know, deep historical inequities, but I think it might get us a little bit more towards a deeper understanding of why aid even exists in the first place. So those are just my beginning thoughts. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And finally, Bright, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Peter. I hope I can match the same degree of conciseness that everybody has shown. But for me, the biggest opportunity is the one that it's created for educating the public. I've been, as an activist, and those of us in this room are perhaps not in that category, but the vast majority of the audiences that matter to us, the citizens of the world, are not familiar at all about this sector. And so this has provided an extraordinary opportunity to settle certain misconceptions, to address certain misconceptions, and certain lack of knowledge, gaps in knowledge, I would say, about this sector. 4 of them, I think, are most pertinent. Number one, there was this general view that aid is something for looser countries, countries that, are never do well, hopeless countries, essentially. And it's been very gratifying trying to explain that as far as the modern system is concerned, aid has always been an important feature coming from the starting from the or rather not even starting from, but certainly stretching from the new republic days of the United States, when the Netherlands was a major funder of US infrastructure. The Louisiana Purchase, the buying of Louisiana from Napoleon, was actually paid for with Dutch money. A huge amount of infrastructure was constructed with French money. There are catalogs of grants and loans that were given by France to the US. A huge amount of China's industrialization was paid for by Japan, nominally over $21 billion. The very last transfer of funds from Japan to China in that program was in 2022. And if you adjust for purchasing power and discounts or for inflation and the like, it exceeds over $100 billion. That's more than most African countries obviously receive. So that is the first misconception that we've had to address about this notion that aid is for hopeless countries. A second one is that not many people were aware that as a percentage of financial flows in the world, official development assistance is extremely tiny. So for official development assistance to cover the current investment gap towards meeting the SDGs, it would have had to increase by more than 10 times for the most minimum coverage of the SDGs. So this is a really small amount of money. I like to tell people that if you took all the money that is spent on global health, aid on global health, and you added it all up, that is still half the amount of money that the rich world spends on chocolates. And if you took all the money that Gavi and the Global Fund has received since the early 2000s when they were founded, that is just a little lower than the amount of money that the rich world spends on Pokemon, the franchise, the game franchise. So this is really, really small. The third misconception that I think this has created an opportunity for us to address, and I think this is very important because connected to the next point, I'm going to try and address it in my subsequent discussions. The third misconception is the fact that already we were moving away from rich governments being the main providers of aid. So in Ghana, where I live, total rich government contribution to Ghana's budget is about 1%. The World Bank and the IMF together contributes almost 15%. So we're already moving from bilateral aid to multilateral aid. And therefore, if you're really keen on making sure you fix aid, it's not rich government aid you want to fix, not the US, Netherlands, the UK. It's really the World Bank IMF system. And what is interesting about that system is that over 95% of the money they have to spend comes from the capital markets, not from governments. So essentially, the World Bank and the IMF and the rest are machines for transforming money from the capital markets, from the private sector into development. And it's that area that you can absorb the most amount of money and deploy. The problem there, and this is where I try and focus the rest of my comments and the rest of the conversation on, is that that money is blocked in important respects in going to the poor. And by that, I mean that the amount of money that is committed, very small amounts are disbursed effectively. So on disbursements alone, there was a time in Ghana, only about 10% of commitments, these were monies that had already been allocated, were being disbursed, only 10%. And now there is moved to about 50%, but that is just on gross disbursement. At effective disbursement rate, you are talking about a third of the money. What does that mean? What that means is that there's a lot more money still available, even in all these chaos. There's still a lot more money available that cannot be disbursed. And that's a very critical point that I'll talk about later. And the last point, which I think Nicola and Sue have already elaborated upon, is the fact that localization wasn't working. The USAID had a target of just 25%, spending only 25% of the money it has through local partners. It could never meet it. The last time that we checked, it was before it was gutted, it was about 9.6%. So essentially, the bulk of the money still stayed in the US, as opposed to, at the very least, went through US partners, which meant, therefore, that the bulk stayed in the US. And therefore, because localization wasn't working, we needed a radical solution anyway. So those are the four misconceptions I think this has provided great opportunity to address. And I will try and explain in later part of the conversation, why these four misconceptions were very important, and addressing them will be key to reimagining aid for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. So many important points raised there. Obviously, we'll only scratch the surface in today's seminar, but I would like to go a bit deeper into some of the points that were raised. And first, I would like to come back to Divine. I think obviously we all agree that the aid system as it was before the current moment was not ideal, and as you identified, there was a certain ambivalence about that system and what it was actually achieving in the world. So if I were to ask you, in your view, what would a good aid system look like? If we were to reimagine the aid system, what would it accomplish? What would it achieve in the world? What would that actually look like in practice? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that the question is, how do we move into a place where we don't have to treat other people as states of emergency, as cases that we have to help, as cases that we have to support? And I use the happiness example also because the countries that are ranked as the happiest country are countries now that are currently putting in a lot of resources to protect themselves against military incursions, that actually have other borders, protect. So the concept itself that you have to rank these countries as happy when there's so much anxiety is very telling of who we are, what we are, and where we are moving to. And I think that over the years, we have standardized this project of dehumanization. We have standardized this project of dependency. We have standardized, this project of defining ourselves, through the subjection of others, that we really need to shift that. And I think that's what we're being called for. We've been asked to rethink diplomacy. What is diplomacy? We're being asked to rethink collaboration. So when you ask me what an ideal aid system would look like, an ideal aid system is a place where there is no aid, where we don't need to aid people, where we actually are support, where there is redistribution, where the resources, and where the entire global community doesn't have to depend on one country, to provide a resource, but where we also acknowledge in the 1990s, many African countries had to collapse their system to adjust to structural adjustments. They had to give away public service in education, in health, in lots of other things. And we are seeing many others crying about the same things in the US. So I hope it is raising awareness about what it means when the UK cuts aid, what it means when Denmark cuts aid, what it means for all the past years, what it has meant for many of these countries. We should be doing deep reflection, Good aid is where there's no aid, but where we have redistributed resources and supported each country to be able to survive, you know.
And perhaps that also links to this idea that historically, when these systems were created in the first place, the idea was that they would perhaps eliminate themselves over time, that this wouldn't be a permanent intervention. And yet here we are in the 2020s still thinking about aid and talking about aid. So maybe that is a particular kind of failure, that the aid system has failed to eliminate the need for aid, as you say. I'd like to come back to you, Nicola, now, and maybe link this conversation back to localization, which is a theme that several of the panelists have raised. So I'm just wondering, as we think about what this reimagination of aid might look like, what would you say is the role of localization in that reimagination?
So I think localization was almost a mirage, in the sense that it gave us this impression that we were moving away from a very top-down and controlled system of ODA, of aid, in which we were gradually getting more resources to the most proximate level, so to local responders, to kind of local communities, to national NGOs, so that they had more autonomy to decide where those resources went and how they were spent. Bright has already said targets weren't enough in practice. The systems were actually so tightly controlled that it was actually really hard to just transfer money and control over that money, flexibility over how that money is spent, to the actors that we recognize are the right place for that power and decision making to lie. So localization is not the right entry point. I'd say from our research, what came across really clearly, so we did a survey that not representative, because it was very much whoever saw the survey responded to the survey, but it was very clear that the process of localization, or locally led development, however you want to call it, is being led by the North. So the very actors that are controlling the system are the ones that are currently the most active in saying how that should be done. Of course, there's that very good phrase, you can't dismantle the master's house with his, what is it? You can't dismantle the master's house with his keys. The master will never dismantle the master's house. So we are trying to kind of make small tweaks in a system that fundamentally will still keep power and control in the global North. One of the problems I see is that as more and more money have flowed into the ODA sector, that control has tightened, because we need to prove impact, we need to prove efficiency, we need to make sure there's no corruption, so that it's become more tightly controlled, it's become more complex, there's more actors to pass it down, and it's just not possible to do that in a way that gets money to where we believe it is. Sadly, I think the most powerful logic of localization for some actors was this idea that it's also more cost efficient. So depending on who you spoke to, you had to say, well, we need localization because it's the morally right thing to do. But other people listen to the language of cost efficiency. So it's 33% cheaper to get local actors to deliver the same things. So localization as a concept and as a philosophy, it never started from the right question, which is, what is the end goal that we want? We need a Southern-oriented system of development cooperation that is rooted in autonomy, dignity, and solidarity, that lets those organizations and communities and governments at the local level decide what development is, what it should look like, and how it should be done. And the kind of conversations around localization without starting there will never end there.
So are you saying that locally based solutions or localization is not really the part of the kind of reimagination that you would advocate for? That is something that we shouldn't?
No, absolutely. I think it stopped us from asking the bigger question, which is what a reimagined system could or should look like. It has masked that more important questions by making us think we're making progress to an end destination that it can never reach to.
That's quite thought-provoking, I imagine, for a lot of people in the room. Thank you for that perspective. I'd like to come back to Sue now. And so in your answer to the first question, you've already alluded to this a little bit, and that is the role of the United States in all of this, as we are thinking about what a reimagined aid system might look like. Presumably, the US is going to play some kind of a role, either being part of that reimagination or potentially the reimagination sort of setting itself apart from the US, or viewing the US as something that actively is not part of what the world is going to do moving forward. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, again, kind of going back to the idea of what the ideal system would be. Ideally, what role would the US play in this process?
I mean, for the last, 80 years, the US has been the leading humanitarian aid provider. So if you think about the US model, it's a shame Nick isn't here to give us more details, but if you compare the US to China's way of engaging, the US has been the humanitarian spender. I really worry that that's going to diminish. I think that there are moves, obviously, we've heard about them, to put the humanitarian aid more firmly under the State Department. But again, that's part of US geopolitical strategy, then. It's part of a nationalist approach to the world. It's not an approach that does the kind of rethinking. So I think we're talking about a world in which states are major players, and these are geopolitical actors. And the United States now, it's very, very clear, is under a new administration that is drastically reshaping the US's position in the world and its posture vis-a-vis a whole series of things. Just look at what's happened in the last week in terms of trade. So I think, as somebody said earlier, aid is a small element in this global political economy. And when you change trade the way that it's being changed right now, that kind of changes the fundamental ground upon which everything's happening. So there is so much to think about right now. It's almost overwhelming in terms of the scope and scale of the changes that are occurring. And I'm not sure we know exactly what will come out of it, but I do think the US is adopting, under the current administration, a much more self-interested, kind of almost mercantilist kind of approach. And I've thought about it as a kind of bully mercantilism, because it might very easily, in fact, we can see it's being discussed in these terms already, turn into the mercantilism of yore, which brought in its wake imperial conquests, and extraction, bold attempts at extraction. And if you think about the way Greenland and Panama and Ukraine even are being discussed at the highest levels in the United States, you can see this kind of logic of, well, if there's something there that we want, we might just go take it. So I think you think about that in the background of this discussion about development and aid, and you've got a drastic rethinking going on in terms of the United States' role in this situation.
So yeah, as you said, obviously there's a change happening as we speak. But I'm also wondering, in an ideal world, presumably we wouldn't just go back to where we were before this change occurred, given all the points that people have raised in this conversation. So I'm just wondering, if you could have it your way, if you were in charge of the US aid system or the aid policy in the US, what would that look like? If it wasn't just a return, to what it was a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that us academics, and people that have been in the field of development, we're very interested in figuring out how we can make this planet more just. We're very interested in figuring out how we don't have to have, as somebody put it, these countries which are perceived as helpless or needing help all the time. Like, we want a world where that's not necessary. I think I am having a bit of a failure of imagination at this very moment in thinking how to get from here to there, but I think that would be my goal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and finally in this round, just wanted to come back to Bright. You talked about several misconceptions. You identified, I think, 3 or 4 in your first answer. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how you think, again, we might be able to deploy our imagination in sort of reimagine the system in a way that takes us away from these misconceptions.
I think, first of all, we have to be very clear that aid is just one small set of this notion of redistribution that Divine talks about. So there's just nothing wrong with money moving from one part of the world to another. It's always happened. I'll give a very classic example. And it's always, had to do with access to markets broadly. Some countries have better access, some countries don't. After the Second World War, Spain was cut off from the Marshall Plan because of Franco and his government. And to surprise you to know, it was Argentina that stepped in the early days to ensure that, Franco's government literally didn't fall. So, and Spain, now it's a wealthier country than Argentina, but it wasn't always like that. Argentina was wealthier in the past than Spain. So these recalibration of, resource flows is not necessarily by themselves wrong. And I think it has to be very important. It's very important that we make that point emphatically. The problem with the current system, especially on the bilateral side, the government to government side, has been that it's been quite ad hoc. So you take the United States, for instance, and distributions range from $17 billion to Ukraine for obvious reasons, all the way to $6,000 to Portugal for obvious reasons, right? So you have these very ad hoc distribution patterns that in many ways had very little to do with actual economic reality. I mean, there's no reason why in Africa, the United States' biggest development cooperation partner in terms of pure distribution of resources or transfer of resources was Egypt. I mean, why is it Egypt? It's just complete ad hoc. It's based on other factors other than the economic. And for that reason, a lot of the problem was that the bilateral end of things was held hostage to politics, not to global development policy, which is why I think the multilateral framework was the right path. And I think we've been on that for a while now, from Monterrey in 2002, if my memory serves me right, all the way to Seville this year. There's been a journey of attempting to describe how a global development system ought to look and how money ought to flow within that. And of that, broader strategy, global development aid was a small piece of it. And I think that we should maintain our focus on that journey. And part of that journey was obviously the one from Paris through Busan to Accra of how you make these global development distributions more effective, more fair, more dignified, etc. The second point I'll make, which I think is critical to this reimagination point, is to re-emphasize the point I made that the monies that were coming through these channels were too small. They weren't going to be able to do any transformative work. They were band-aid. The amount of money you really need is going to have to come from the private markets. And you need some kind of machine that would transform the risk premium that exists in the private market to enable you to move large amount of money. I always shock people by reminding them that private money that moves in the United States every day through the Fedwire system is $4.5 trillion. Total global development aid annually is about $223 billion. There's no way we can match the scale of the private financial sector in terms of resources that are available. The machines that were invented through the World Bank IMF model to use bonds in the private markets and then guarantees by rich country governments to de-risk them so the World Bank will lend at a lower cost to countries is the most effective machine that we have at present. How do we know that? Take, for instance, Gavi and the International Finance Facility, which was initially thought of as a small subset of the overall Gavi strategy. Gavi is this agency that provides vaccination service around the world. Now, Gavi initially was entirely dependent on donations from rich governments. Then it realized that that was not going to be effective and on its own. And therefore, you needed a market-based mechanism through which it could borrow money in the private markets and then use that money to lend to countries. That segment or that category today has generated about $10 billion out of the overall $30 billion in the Gavi bucket, and not even out of real intent, because they never use guarantees. They just securitize the donations, which is not a very effective method compared to the World Bank and the rest. So we know where we can get a lot of money is the private markets, and you have to find a machine that converts money from the private market, lowers the risk, and allow you to deploy. To do that, we need to solve one problem, and this is my last point. There is a confusion around, or rather, there is a gulf between hard development and soft development. So hard development is your bridges, your roads, your power plants, and the like. And then soft development is your standards, your governance mechanisms, your values-based approaches to trying to transfer money, etc., etc. That confusion manifests in so many levels. One level in which it manifests is that soft development moves very fast because we change our minds very quickly as evidence comes. When you think of hard development, how we build roads, how we build schools, that hasn't changed much. Over the last 500 years, bridges have stayed bridges. The technology may have changed in marginal terms. How we do gender affirmative care in hospitals, on the other hand, has changed rapidly. What that means, therefore, is that the policy innovation you need to handle soft development is very rapid pace to get countries to understand what soft development is required. And that speed means there's been a gap between hard development and soft development. And it's created what I call catanomy, a gap between how you handle hard development and how you handle soft development. Some countries have done better at syncing the two, Singapore and the rest. In Africa, we haven't done too well. So every time we've tried to accelerate hard development, build more bridges, build more schools, we fall into debt traps. We have another debt crisis and we have to be rescued. We need to figure out what is the best method to sync or to synchronize hard development and soft development and to do it effectively. And I think the missing piece is local accountability. And the reason is because soft development is such a rapid pace activity that only local actors that are very well informed can engage in the oversight that will prevent these activities on the hard side from becoming debt traps. And I think we haven't done well as a global society in figuring out how we build that soft development capacity in countries. Because for now, all we've done is just impose it. So you come in as the World Bank, country partnership framework, you speak a lot of English, but a lot of people in the country don't understand what you're saying. So the national audience for policy on the soft side is very small. It's 100 people who understand these jargon and these terms. We need to figure out a way to expand that. And I think the way to do that is mass technocratic activism. We need people in policy in these countries to become actors on the mass level. And until that happens, I think it's going to be really difficult. So that's my view for how you reimagine the dynamic. Move a lot of private sector capital, but to make sure that when it goes into hard infrastructure, countries can pay back, you need to fix the soft side of development. You can't fix the soft side of development by simply imposing standards from the West. You need to have bottom-up emergence. And to do that, you need technocrats in the developing world, in countries like my own, to become part of the political conversation, to move to the masses, and to transform the conversation so that the audience for policy is much bigger.
Okay, thank you so much. Lots of things to digest there. I'm just aware of the time. We're now sort of at quarter to the hour, so I would like to make sure that we answer some of the audience questions as well. There have been lots of great questions that have been posed, and I do apologize that we won't be able to get to all of them. But I'm going to start with a question from Nimi Hoffman. I'm just going to read this out. Divine spoke about a world in which we do not need aid. What can we learn from earlier attempts to restructure the global political economy and the ways in which these were thwarted? I'm thinking here in particular of the collapse of the new international economic order in the UN system, which sought to stabilize commodity prices, govern transnational corporations, ensure significant flows of investment and technology to the global south. There are some signs of attempts to resuscitate this kind of counter-hegemonic thinking, particularly in the form of the AU's push for tax justice instead of charity, the Caribbean call for reparations, and the call for democratizing the UN system, including the UNSC, IMF, and World Bank. But the pushback is enormous. So given that this is linking to point that Divine make, maybe I'll ask Divine first, but if the rest of the panel would like to say something to this as well, please do feel free.
Thank you very much, Peter and Nimi. Again, I think that Omar indicated that aid is just one. And that's a very important point to emphasize, that this is just one. But it is problematic because quite often it is founded on the foreign policy priority of a particular place. If it's coming from a state. If it's not coming from a state, because there's also international organizations and many who provide support, but which is also founded upon their own priority. So while there may be an intersection between what the local interest is and what the external interest is, quite often it is driven by a particular push that is coming from somewhere else. So, and I think that we have an opportunity to rethink our relationship. And at the core of it is, how do we build a more dignified world? I think that everyone else is interested in this, even those who are activating now, I mean, what we're pushing this crisis. I think the push amongst everyone is the fear for dignity, the fear for respect. And it requires us to all rethink, whether you're on the left or on the right. It's an important moment for all of us. How do we move collectively together How do we ensure that we move to a place where we redistribute? How do we build other economies? How do we build other societies? How do we get to a place where we do not have dead aid, where we are not building places that are disrespectful, where we are not assuming that we can learn from other people, where we think technical advice is a one-way flow, where how do we move to that point? I think we are being pushed to think about it. And the problem is that asking this question is the existential. We have to ask questions about ourselves, who we are, why we exist, and our relationship to other people in order to move to that place. And that's a difficult part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone else like to add to this from the panel?
Yes, but oh, sorry, go ahead, please, Nicola.
Are you sure? Very quickly. I think this also speaks to this idea of bringing publics along with us, because the pushback is enormous, because this is where power is deeply concentrated, and some power is willing to be ceded, but there are other forms of power, centralized power, that will not be ceded and will be fought till their dying breath. It's movements of people, not the politicians, not the stakeholders, that can call for that power to change, that can spotlight why we need to change, that can spotlight the injustices in a way that speaks to a much larger number of people and populations around the world. But it's also not enough to just call it out. We need ways that we can get behind building better as well. I mean, if we know Marshall Gantz's work, he said, yes, it's all good to protest, it's all good to sort of critique, but unless we're building, at the end of it, we get left with nothing, which is where we are now with all of the critiquing of the aid system. Sue brought this out this earlier. We've been critiquing to try and make change, but actually it's kind of pulled the entire system to its knees. And because we haven't been doing the right types of building, we don't yet have that reimagined future. So I think this cannot happen without bringing in broad domestic constituencies right around the world to make progress.
Thank you, Nicola. There are two quick points that I think are critical for making progress. One is that we need to acknowledge that the center of economic gravity is moving away from the west to the east, from the north to the south. You can just look at the GDP numbers, and it's very clear. We've gone from a world in which in 2000, the United Kingdom was a major trading partner of about a third of African countries. Today, it's not a major trading partner, not a top 3 trading partner of any African country. And China is a top 3 trading partner, not top 1 trading partner for almost 2/3 of African countries. So this is huge. What that means is that the amount of money available for development has also shifted. That raises a second point, which is that historically, the West, the global North, did a lot of the spending in global aid. More and more, we're going to require others to do that spending. And even if we don't call it aid, and we just say it's mutual partnership and it's cross-border investment, whatever we call it, a lot of that money is going to come from China and the rest. The problem with that happening is that all of the countries seem to be learning from each other's mistakes. Before 1968, before the Pearson Commission, the global North, the West, spent primarily on hard development. They built schools, they gave money for building schools, for building bridges, for building power dams. People forget, most power plants in Africa were built by European and American investors. Then there was a huge debt crisis in the 80s. The London Club got into big trouble. The big banks, all of them got into big trouble, and they stopped giving money to Africa. There were the Brady bonds. Then we moved on to a world in which African governments went into the bond market, and now we have another crisis with Ghana and the rest defaulting. The Chinese came in and did the same, or put all the money into hard development, bridges, the rest of the rest, until recently when the Kenyans and the rest said, we can't pay for these railways and the like. Now the Chinese have stopped, and they're talking about small is beautiful. The UAE and the Saudis have stepped in, and they are giving money now to Uganda to try and build power plants and everything. So what we seem to be doing is recycling the problems, right? Recycling the misunderstandings of how you do development. You can put as much money into hard development as you want. If you don't fix the soft development, you're going to have trouble. So Noreen is asking, how do you do it? The challenge is this. In soft development, you need a lot of local accountability. To get local accountability, we need to distinguish between 2 forms of local accountability, political and policy. A lot of people get confused because they think the 2 are the same. They are not. So when you look at, say, voice and accountability on many global development and governance indicators, you see, the voice and accountability metric doesn't favor countries like China and the rest. But people are focusing on political accountability. In China, you cannot have political accountability because of the nature of the system. But there's massive policy accountability. How does that happen? Because the audience for policy accountability is much smaller in every country. So the Chinese think tanks, the Chinese scholars, they put as much pressure on ministers when it comes to the technical content of policy as they do in France, as they do in Germany, and sometimes more. So Singapore may not have the same political accountability that you have in the UK, but on policy accountability, my view is that Singapore has higher policy accountability than you have because the audience for policy in Singapore is actually bigger than in many European countries. So in African countries where we have these kind of problems, we've seen now that countries like Ghana and Kenya that are very democratic and so have a lot of political accountability are not performing as well. And recently, the Ivory Coast outperformed Ghana, has a bigger GDP on a CPI basis, is better than Ghana. How does that happen? Policy accountability in Ivory Coast improved, while policy accountability in Ghana declined, even as political accountability increased. So that inverse relationship that happened in Ghana has led to Ivory Coast now outperforming Ghana on major indices of development. I think that misconception between policy accountability versus political accountability has confused a lot of people on what we mean when we say local accountability is critical. We're not talking about broad political accountability. While that is useful, when it comes to this issue of how you utilize your resource effectively, I think policy accountability must take primacy. And that is where we've had a big challenge in terms of the audience that are available. So I hope
Thank you,
Noreen
thank you for addressing that question as well. I'm just aware of the time. I'd like to try and get to at least one or two more questions. There was a question from Rob who talked about something that Nicola mentioned, but I think something that relates to what we all talked about, and that is the misconceptions and erroneous perceptions about aid and development. And so Rob asks, how important do you see the conversation with constituents in the global north to be as part of this reimagining? I'm thinking here about the US particularly, obviously the public in the United States, and perceptions of aid and development seem to be very important in driving what the administration in the US is doing. I mean, Sue, do you have any thoughts on the public in the global north?
Yeah, I mean, I will say actually that I think it was a surprise when USAID was the first agency to be completely chopped up, basically, because it wasn't a big agenda in the election. It wasn't something that the public were like, oh, we must reform aid. That was not in the town hall discussions that were going on around the presidential election. It really wasn't there. So I think there's a lot of, probably not so great logic as to why that it ended up being on the chainsaw, victim list. But I think one thing that I'd like to say, though, about where I think we're going in the United States, and this does relate to things other panelists have said, is that, and to the question that you posed, Peter, is that I think we're going to get to the investor model, right? So pretty quickly, it's going to be, well, we don't need to be giving people things, and this would fit with the public's perception. We need to be, investing, making smart decisions about investing and generating returns for the country, ourselves, and for the investors, but also it's win-win because, the projects we're investing in will generate multiplier effects and so on. And this is the hard development that Bright's been talking about, I believe. So I think, we've seen a trend toward making development investable, which is how Gabor puts it in one of the recent papers. And I think that's definitely kind of something that jives with the public's imagination here in the United States. And I think we're seeing clear signs that there's going to be attempts at establishing a sovereign wealth fund here in the United States that will be the first time at the national level to do some of this work and to mobilize private capital and engage in some of this investment. So I think that's maybe something that we can look for.
Nicola, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I will, if that's okay, very quickly. So keep your eyes out on Alliance magazine. I've got a co-piece there that actually sees this as the missing piece of Shift the Power agendas, is educating, conversing, discussing with publics in the global north, but also around the world, that we need to be brought into these conversations. We need to be behind them. I don't believe that any political system can be the solution to the reimagined future that we are all talking about and all equally bought into today. So it's not just that the public needs to support a better system. My personal belief, and why we started One World Together, is we are also the solution. It's people that are not governments, that are not tied to taxation and kind of reporting and accountability. We can support and build a better system that is value-based. So for me, it's not just the missing piece in preventing the worst of the system that we've got, it's also in building the new system.
Okay. Any final thoughts from the panel? I don't think we will have the time to tackle another question. But is there anything I'd just like to, before I wrap up, just to give a chance to the panel, just to pick out any final points or any final thoughts on what we've talked about?
I can start. I think that taking seriously the opportunity to do self-reflection is very important. We are not going to move into a different space if we spend a lot of time externalizing it. I think that it's important. We acknowledge, we know what has happened, but what we have not really done is reflecting on ourselves, each as a person, as an individual, as an organization, as a country, how far we've come, how much we've contributed to this particular context, and how we need to move out. There's also a tendency now just to focus so much on the US, but this has been a long history. The UK has to ask itself so much questions. The French for a long time, the last report by Mbembe and also the push against it and lots of others. So there is a push to really rethink our collective inhabiting and cohabitation of this community. And it's very important that we take this opportunity and do it. Otherwise, it will be a failed opportunity. Yeah.
We're down to 1 minute, so I think I might, unless anybody has any burning points that they would like to mention, I think I might start. Nicola, maybe do you want to?
I just want to make one thing clear. Civil society is left out of the equation when we discuss aid, but civil society is also a very necessary condition for a reimagined system, a flourishing.
Nicola, actually, my point about policy accountability involves the part of civil society that focuses on policy. I also think that all of us will agree that if we were designing an aid system for the world today, it wouldn't be like the current one. And that, at the very least, is a positive note to end on.
Yes, absolutely. So that very much brings to also what I was going to say, which is that really the point of today's conversation was not to sort of lament what was lost, but to think about what could be. And I think all of us have agreed and brought different perspectives to this question of what that reimagination might look like. And with that, I would like to first of all thank the panel for sharing very generously all of their thinking on this, but also all the people who came to today's seminar, and encourage you to think about, and as Divine said, to reflect on some of these deeper questions of ethics, of history, of imagination, going beyond the technocratic, going beyond the everyday, and seeing the disruption to the everyday as an opportunity to rethink and reflect on what could be in the future. Thank you all so very much. I think there will be a poll that the DSA will put out about future events and which areas that we covered might be of interest. So please do participate in that as well. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.